Self-Forgiveness, a heuristic study of the lived experience of forgiving oneself, by Diana Smith, licensed practical counselor with a mental health specialty and doctoral candidate at Capella University. My name is Diana Smith. I own and operate Serenity Mental Health Services. I've been in private practice for the past 15 years, and I am licensed by the National Board of Certified Counselors. I am currently working on my doctoral dissertation for my PhD at Capella University. My research is being overseen by my faculty mentor, Dr. Gabby McCulloch. My research question is, what is the lived experience of becoming self-forgiving? My research will be based on the definition of self-forgiveness by Enright, who defines self-forgiveness as a willingness to abandon self-resentment in the face of one's own acknowledged objective wrong while fostering compassion, generosity, and love towards oneself. Enright also defines forgiveness of others as, when unjustly hurt by another, we forgive when we overcome the resentment toward the offender, not by denying our right to the resentment, but instead by trying to offer the wrongdoer compassion, benevolence, and love. As we give these, we as forgivers realize that the offender does not necessarily have a right to such gifts. Instead of struggling with the decision of reconciliation with another, self-forgiveness requires reconciliation with oneself. This is important because children, young adults, and adults who do not feel that they belong due to a past trauma and experience an inability to forgive can become discouraged to the point of depression and neurosis. The depth and lack of understanding of what forgiveness is and what its limits are has become more obvious. Thus, in spite of the surge in forgiveness research, there continues to be a need for a better understanding of the forgiveness process. Holland and Sham found that forgiveness research is focused on interpersonal forgiveness, forgiveness of others, and that intrapersonal forgiveness, self-forgiveness, is a much-needed area of study. Literature tends to focus primarily on forgiveness in relation to others, and tends to minimize the concept of self-forgiveness. Thus, a relatively unexplored aspect of forgiveness is self-forgiveness, which this study will examine. Forgiveness is both a developmental construct and a counseling model have been well documented in the literature for decades. Most of the research on forgiveness has been quantitative and is focused on the constructs of forgiveness as they are related to mental health. Instead of focusing on the constructs of forgiveness, this heuristic phenomenological design will be bound by individuals who have experienced the phenomenon of self-forgiveness. This study will be retrospective because the researcher and co-researchers have already experienced the process of self-forgiveness prior to participation in the research. I will be recruiting 8 adults over the age of 30 to participate in my study as co-researchers. Volunteers must be at least 30 years of age so that they are able to articulate their lived experience of self-forgiveness. Participants must be in good physical and mental health. A flyer will be published in newspapers, in local community centers, church bulletins, and ads will be run on radio stations in the northern Black Hills of South Dakota, as well as on social media sites such as Facebook, in an attempt to find volunteers for this study. Volunteers will be given a phone number to call the researcher for an initial screening. Volunteers that meet the criteria will be considered co-researchers. Participants will come from a purposeful sample as defined by those individuals who have experienced self-forgiveness and due to the self-forgiveness process had their lives transformed. Participants must be passionate about their self-forgiveness process and able and willing to articulate their experience to provide a rich, thick description of the self-forgiveness process. The qualitative heuristic design will allow this researcher to explore forgiveness of self by examining this researcher's and the co-researcher's experience of self-forgiveness to gain a better understanding of the self-forgiveness process. This will be achieved by participating in exhaustive self-searching and dialogues with self and others, and creative depictions of the self-forgiveness process. Heuristic comes from the Greek word heuriskin, which means to discover or to find. Mustakis describes the heuristic research method as an internal process the researcher goes through to discover the nature and meaning of an experience. Mustakis describes the heuristic process as an investigation that requires self-searching, self-dialogue, and self-discovery, that is anchored in the question and flows out of an inner awareness, meaning, and inspiration. He stated that through an unwavering and steady inward gaze, an inner freedom to explore and accept what is, quote, I am reaching into deeper and deeper regions of a human problem or experience and can come to know and understand its underlying dynamics and constituents more and more fully, unquote. This process requires passion to understand the phenomenon as well as a disciplined commitment and rigor to move beyond the ordinary levels of awareness, living the question internally in sources of being and non-being, recording hunches, ideas, and essences as they emerge, and ultimately consulting with the other regarding the phenomenon or experience. Mustakis describes the heuristic research method as an internal process the researcher goes through to discover the nature and meaning of an experience. This heuristic process will consist of narratives from the researcher and co-researchers. The data will be gathered from an autobiographical description of the textures and structures of the lived experience of self-forgiveness. During the initial screening, volunteers will be asked to briefly describe their self-forgiveness experience and how the self-forgiveness process has transformed their lives. Participants that qualify for the study will then be asked to think about their self-forgiveness experience and write a brief narrative about their experience. They will be provided an email address and asked to email their narrative to this researcher. Once the narrative is received by the researcher via email and read, the participant will be notified whether or not they have been chosen to participate in the study. Journaling and semi-structured interviews will be used to provide a safe setting to describe the self-forgiveness phenomenon experienced. During the first meeting, the co-researchers will be given informed consent forms that explain the nature and purpose of the study, the limits of confidentiality, and the right to withdraw from the study at any point, and they will be instructed to read and sign all consent forms. Following the signing of the forms, there will be a semi-structured interview that will be recorded. A total of 8 co-researchers will be emailed the list of questions that will be asked during the semi-structured interviews. Volunteers that are local to the area and meet the criteria to be in the study will be set up with a time to meet for approximately 1 hour at a local library to participate in a semi-structured interview. Volunteers that are not local to the area and that meet the criteria to be in the study will be set up with a time to participate in a semi-structured interview via Skype or some other internet service that provides a face-to-face interview that can be recorded. Any data collected will be kept confidential in accordance with Capella policy and best practices for ethical research. Neither participants nor sites will be identified in any report of my findings or in my published dissertation. I will provide a copy of the aggregated results from my study upon your request. I would like to take this time to thank you for listening to my presentation about my study on self-forgiveness, and invite anybody who is interested in participating in my study to contact me. My email address is dianasmith@serenitymentalhealth.com, or you can call me at 605-348-3125. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.